fresh off an NBA Finals run, the PHNX Suns need to get young. No, not young, young, as in Thaddeus Young. As the Athletic Shamsharania reported a few weeks ago, the Suns are among the contenders that have pursued the 33-year-old forward, recently acquired by the Spurs in the DeMar DeRozan sign-and trade with the Bulls. Last season in the Windy City, Young averaged 12.1 points, 6.2 rebounds, and 4.3 assists per game, while starting in just 23 of his 68 appearances. And despite only logging the 9th most minutes per game on the team, he still managed to record the second most win shares on the roster, trailing only All-Star Zach LaVine. With Young being on an expiring $12.4 million contract, a trade package of Dario Saric, Jalen Smith, and some sort of draft compensation works logistically. The question is, how would he fit in with the Suns? What would he bring to the table, and is it worth punting on a well-liked, albeit injured, player like Saric, as well as a second-year big with potential like Sticks? A look at Young's last season with the Bulls provides some clarity on where he might shine in Phoenix and where he might struggle. At 6'8", Thad Young has rarely been utilized as a point forward throughout his 14-year NBA career. Yet in Chicago last year, he often functioned as a playmaking big man, nearly doubling his previous career high in assists per game. According to NBA.com, the only players 6'7" or taller who averaged more assists per 36 minutes were Luka Doncic, Nikola Jokic, LeBron James, Ben Simmons, Jimmy Butler, Tomas Satoransky, Domantas Sabonis, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. All-stars and all-NBA players all around, with the exception of his teammate Satoransky, who was basically an oversized point guard. According to the B-Ball Index, Young was an exceptional facilitator regardless of position, ranking in the upper percentile in every playmaking category, and as cleaning the glass notes, his career-high 25.4 assist percentage ranked in the 96th percentile as well. It's pretty easy to see the numbers point to Young being an elite playmaker. The thing is, most of his assists aren't particularly flashy. If anything, he's just an effective, smart passer. In Chicago, his greatest strength in the pick and roll wasn't typically his finishing ability, but rather what he did with the rock when defenses collapsed on the short roll. Whether it was threading the needle to another big man in the dunker spot, finding an open cutter off the ball, or making the right pass to an open shooter on the perimeter, Young routinely punished defensive rotations by moving the ball exactly where it needed to go. It wasn't always in the pick and roll, but even when he sneakily slipped around the screen, or any time he caught the ball near the basket for that matter, Young made the fundamentally sound pass to the open man, almost to the point of frustration. In defense of Young, who only shot 66% on his looks at the rim, his greatest threat was often as a passer, not a scorer. A considerable number of his assists came from simple handoffs where a Bulls guard or wing would get him the ball with his back to the basket before quickly curling around him for a quick-fire three. These blink-and-you-missed-it kind of plays relied on Young's ability to carve out space with his hips, jam his ass into anyone who got too close, and often keep one or two defenders at bay with pure thickness before immediately feeding the ball back to his open teammate with a quick little pitch play. Even when he didn't create contact, that momentary obstruction gave his guards the split-second advantage needed to get off a clean look. It's not difficult to imagine just how much damage mid-range artillerymen like Chris Paul and Devin Booker could do with even the slightest bit of space Young provides on handoffs just like these. This more extreme example borders on being whistled for an offensive foul, but just look at how Jaylen Brown bounces off that hip check like he just got sideswiped by a smart car. These are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of Young's ability to facilitate from the perimeter. Monty Williams has repeatedly praised Dario Saric and Frank Kaminsky as being connectors, guys who can keep the .5 offense moving when they catch the ball at the top of the key by either putting it on the floor or making sharp passes to off-ball cutters. Young isn't much of a ball handler, but a lot of Chicago's offense was predicated on feeding him on the perimeter, running a bunch of guards and wings all over the court in off-ball actions, and letting him zip passes to whichever cutter opened up. Some of these reads seem simple enough, but being able to anticipate where the defense is and when his cutter will free up, as well as actually fire that pass into crowded spaces, is a gift. It was a recurring staple of Young's facilitating in Chicago, and his one-handed, over-the-head dimes were almost reminiscent of Nikola Jokic. Young routinely looked like a quarterback going through his progressions, staying patient in the pocket as he rifled through his primary, secondary, and tertiary options before making the right throw. And make no mistake about it, if you cut, Thad Young will find you. With that rocket of a left arm, that man is not afraid to sling that thing all over the court. In Monty's .5 offense, the ball doesn't stick very often, and when it does, it's usually in the hands of someone looking to create their own shot in isolation like Paul or Booker. Even if the Suns made a move for Young, they wouldn't change their whole system just to incorporate one facilitating bench big who had a great year on the NBA's 21st ranked offense. In other words, don't expect to see too much of Young sitting at the top of the key with the ball in his hands for 5 or 6 seconds while Suns cut every which way. That was what Chicago needed from him, and it contributed to his career best season as a playmaker. With that being said, watching some of Thad's lefty lasers, there's more than enough court vision, instinct, and quick decision making to mesh with a system predicated on all three. Young can be particularly effective on those short rolls by feeding DeAndre Ayton or JaVale McGee in the dunker spot, rewarding cutters like Mikal Bridges or Cam Johnson, or locating three-point snipers like Bridges, Johnson, Jay Crowder, or Landry Shamet on the weak side. Even with defenses laying off Young due to his lack of perimeter touch, he's still comfortable taking 1 or 2 dribbles to force the issue and make the right play from there. Or, pulling shit like this out of nowhere every once in a blue moon. Young would obviously be a nice addition in the playmaking department, especially for a team that will be missing Dario this season, but he wouldn't be a seamless fit either, and some of his flaws are worth addressing. The one glaring drawback is his lack of perimeter touch. While his passing makes him appear like the exact kind of front court connector that Monty loves, his three-point shooting doesn't even come close to what Saric or Kaminsky provided in that regard. He's simply not a great shooter in most respects, as these numbers from the B-Ball Index point out. It's not like it was just a down year either. He's a career 33.1% shooter from long range on low volume. The Suns may have been middle of the pack in long-range attempts, but they ranked 7th in three-point percentage. Young's deficiencies as a shooter matter, and they could affect where he'd most effectively slot in on this particular roster, since basically all of the Suns' fours were credible threats from beyond the arc. Aside from that, the knocks on Young are pretty minor. Like the Suns, he gets to the free throw line at an alarmingly low rate, ranking in the 7th percentile of the league last year, so he wouldn't be able to help in that regard. He was also a bit turnover prone with a 15.4 turnover percentage, and he was actually a minus on the defensive end for the Bulls, though that may be mostly due to playing on a bad defensive team in general. There's also the obvious sentimental factor. Trading a well-liked player like Saric, both in the locker room and by the fan base, would sting, especially in the wake of a devastating ACL tear that came at the worst possible time. Similarly, some might feel disappointed if the Suns gave up on Jalen Smith, a second-year player that Phoenix drafted ahead of Tyrese Halliburton and Tyrese Maxey, before actually getting a more extensive look at what he can do. With that being said, even bearing Styx's all-summer league performance in mind, this is a business, and James Jones will do what he must to get the Suns back in the finals and over the hump this time. So if that means sacrificing an injured player like Saric and a second-year big who hasn't shown much in an NBA setting for a certifiable upgrade like Young, he will pursue that option. The biggest obstacle might be what draft compensation he has to include to entice the Spurs into a deal. San Antonio will get plenty of interest for Thad Young around the league, and 2 second-rounders may not be enough to entice the Spurs' interests. At that point, the Suns may have to consider including a protected first-round pick if they think Thad Young is someone who can positively impact their playoff rotation. For now, let's assume the Suns find a way to entice the Spurs and the swap is made. The big question then becomes where Young would play, since he'd be the latest in a long line of current Suns capable of playing multiple positions. There's a good case for him replacing Saric straight up as the prototypical small ball 5. According to Cleaning the Glass, Young logged most of his time at center last year, posting a pretty impressive point differential in the process. The other 43% of his minutes, he played the 4 spot, and the numbers weren't quite as impressive, but still good. Furthermore, his assist percentage shot up when he was a 5, putting him in elite territory as a playmaker from that spot. Monty wasn't afraid to deploy Saric as a full-time backup 5, and even dabbled with some Torrey Craig in undersized lineups there, so Young would make sense there too. The wrinkle there is the Suns already addressed the backup 5 spot in the offseason by adding JaVale McGee. For all of Saric and Kaminsky's skills as connectors, the Suns got beat up in the finals by the towering Milwaukee Bucks, especially after Saric went down and Ayton struggled with foul trouble. Adding an experienced, legitimate center like McGee is a definite plus, and despite his inability to spread the floor, Young did spend considerable time as a 4 in Chicago, building chemistry alongside Nikola Vucevic after he joined the Bulls. The difference is Vucevic is a good floor spacer, making 40% of his threes last year. Neither McGee nor Ayton are in that same stratosphere, so spacing would be crucial whenever Young logged minutes as a 4, since the only area he's really above average as a scoring threat is on short mid-range shots in the 4 to 14 feet range. The good news is, no matter which position he played on a roster full of multi-positional weapons, Young provides value with his playmaking, his penchant for racking up steals, and his knack for crashing the glass. In fact, Thad ranked in the 75th percentile for offensive rebounding percentage last year, and a considerable number of his assists stemmed from fighting for loose boards before a quick kickout for three, one of the most demoralizing plays in basketball for any defense. Whether he'd play the 4 behind Jay Crowder or the 5 behind Ayton is really for Monty to tinker with, much like he did last year in the front court until the Suns' preferred starting 5 finally figured each other out. It could very well be matchup dependent during the regular season too. Some opponents may call for a small ball approach with Young at the 5, while others might demand more size with Cam Johnson at the 3, Young at the 4, and McGee at center. Positional versatility and some overlapping skill sets should be seen as a luxury, not a curse. These days, Young's name is an oxymoron. At 33, he's no spring chicken. It's possible he'd amount to a one-year rental, and it would cost the Suns a beloved player and a much younger one with room to grow. With that being said, even if he's not the typical James Jones shooter, Young is definitely a Monty Williams guy who'd fit well in the .5 offense as long as they could mask his lack of a three-point shot. That Achilles heel certainly didn't hold him back with the Bulls, whose offensive rating plummeted without him on the court. Bearing all that in mind, it's hard to see how Thaddeus Young would be anything less than a significant upgrade to the bench of a championship-caliber roster. For this edition of Bourguet Breakdowns, this is Gerald Bourguet, signing off.